March 7th, 1945. 16:35 hours. East bank of the Rhine River, Remagen, Germany. Private First Class Thomas Bennett, a combat medic with the 9th Armored Division, moved through the smoking wreckage of what had been a German defensive position hours earlier. The Ludendorff Bridge, miraculously intact despite German demolition attempts, now carried American forces across the Rhine into the heart of Germany. The defenders who'd failed to destroy it lay scattered among the fortifications. Bennett heard the sound before he saw the source, a high-pitched whimpering that didn't match the usual tones of wounded combat veterans. He followed it to a crater where a German soldier crouched against the dirt wall, clutching his left leg. Blood seeped through his fingers. His right hand gripped a pistol, but the trembling suggested he lacked either will or strength to use it. When Bennett approached, the German raised the pistol with shaking hands. Bennett could see his face clearly now, smooth cheeks barely touched by adolescence, eyes wide with terror, lips moving in what might have been prayer. The uniform hung loose on a frame that looked underfed even before combat. This wasn't a soldier. This was a child wearing a soldier's costume. "Easy, son," Bennett said softly, raising his empty hands. "Medic, sanitator." The boy's gun hand wavered, his face contorted with confusion and fear. When Bennett took another step forward, the German threw the pistol aside, pressed himself against the crater wall, and began sobbing. Not the controlled tears of a man, but the helpless crying of a frightened child who'd reached the absolute limit of what he could endure. Bennett knelt beside him and gently moved the boy's hands away from the leg wound. Shrapnel had torn through the calf, but the bleeding wasn't arterial. Survivable. Bennett pulled out his medical kit and began working, while the German teenager watched with an expression of complete incomprehension, as if Bennett were performing magic rather than basic trauma care. "You're going to be okay," Bennett said, knowing the boy probably didn't understand English, but hoping the tone would communicate what words couldn't. "You're safe now." The German boy stared at Bennett's hands as they cleaned the wound, applied sulfa powder, and wrapped clean bandages around his calf. When Bennett offered his canteen, the boy took it with trembling hands and drank like he hadn't tasted clean water in days. Then he looked directly at Bennett's face and whispered a single German word that needed no translation. "Warum?" Why? Bennett didn't have an answer that would fit in German vocabulary he didn't possess. He just shrugged, patted the boy's shoulder gently, and moved on to find the next wounded soldier who needed help, leaving the German teenager sitting in the crater, staring at the clean bandage on his leg like it was evidence of something he'd been told was impossible. The child army of the Reich's collapse. By March 1945, Nazi Germany's systematic destruction of its own future had reached its logical conclusion. Children fighting desperate defensive actions against professional armies, while the regime that had betrayed them collapsed around them. The Volkssturm and Hitler Youth conscription had evolved from desperate measure to standard practice, feeding adolescent bodies into a military meat grinder that consumed them without meaningful strategic effect. The statistics documented institutional child sacrifice. Hitler Youth members aged 15-17 in combat roles, January-May 1945, approximately 80,000-100,000. Teenage casualties in final 5 months, estimated 20,000-25,000 killed, 30,000-40,000 wounded. Teenage German POWs captured by American forces, March-May 1945, approximately 35,000-45,000. Wounded teenage POWs requiring medical treatment, approximately 15,000-18,000. Average age of captured Hitler Youth combatants, 16.3 years. Percentage who believed Americans executed prisoners, approximately 85-90%. Average training period before deployment, 5 to 10 days. The teenage soldiers captured by American forces had been systematically conditioned to expect execution or torture if captured. Nazi propaganda had spent years depicting Americans as barbaric monsters who showed no mercy to prisoners, particularly to young soldiers who represented the future of German resistance. The indoctrination was so complete that many teenage POWs attempted suicide rather than face capture, genuinely believing death by their own hand was preferable to what Americans would do to them. The psychological conditioning created tactical problems for American forces. Teenage German soldiers fought with suicidal desperation, born not from courage, but from terror of capture. They couldn't surrender because surrender meant torture and death. The propaganda that was supposed to strengthen resistance instead created situations where frightened children fought to the death rather than accept quarter from enemies they believed were demons. The shock of survival. For teenage German POWs who'd been conditioned to expect execution, the discovery that American medics were actually trying to save their lives created psychological disorientation as profound as physical trauma. The systematic kindness contradicted everything they'd been taught about American character and military practice. The initial response was often disbelief. Wounded teenage POWs would watch American medics working on their injuries with expressions suggesting they thought they were hallucinating or experiencing elaborate deception that would end in cruelty. Some refused treatment initially, preferring to die untreated rather than face torture they believed medical care would precede. 16-year-old Klaus Richter, captured with severe burns near Cologne, described his psychological state. "I'd been taught Americans skinned prisoners alive, that they tortured young soldiers because we represented future resistance. When the American medics started treating my burns, gently, carefully, giving me morphine for the pain, I thought I was already dead, and this was some kind of afterlife hallucination. I couldn't process that the enemy was helping me survive." The moment of realization, when teenage POWs understood that American medical care was genuine and not prelude to execution, often produced emotional breakdowns. Boys who'd maintained stoic composure during capture would suddenly begin crying uncontrollably when they understood they weren't going to die, that the propaganda had been lies, that enemies were treating them with more humanity than their own government had shown. The psychological transformation happened rapidly for most teenage POWs. Within hours of receiving medical care, the terror would drain away, replaced by confusion, gratitude, and tentative trust. The speed of the transformation demonstrated how shallow the propaganda conditioning had been, built on fear rather than genuine conviction, collapsing immediately when confronted with contradictory evidence. The field hospitals. American field hospitals established behind advancing front lines became spaces where former enemies discovered shared humanity through the universal experience of pain, healing, and medical care. Wounded teenage German POWs received treatment in the same facilities as wounded American soldiers, often in adjacent beds, attended by the same medical personnel. The proximity forced acknowledgement of common humanity that combat conditions had obscured. American soldiers recovering from wounds found themselves next to German teenagers recovering from similar injuries. The shared experience of being patients rather than combatants created common ground, where nationality and uniform became less important than the universal desire to survive and heal. The medical staff, doctors, nurses, medics, orderlies, made no distinctions in care quality based on nationality. Teenage German POWs received the same antibiotics, the same surgical interventions, the same pain medication, the same nursing attention as American patients. The equal treatment demonstrated values that propaganda had claimed Americans didn't possess. Staff Sergeant Edward Morrison, a surgical technician at a field hospital near Frankfurt, described the ward dynamics. We had American kids and German kids in the same ward, all wounded, all scared, all wanting to go home. The German teenagers would watch how we treated our own wounded, then realize they were getting the same care. You'd see it in their faces, the propaganda crumbling, being replaced by understanding that we actually gave a damn whether they lived or died. The field hospitals also became sites of cultural exchange despite language barriers. American patients would share candy and cigarettes with German teenagers in neighboring beds. Nurses would learn German phrases to communicate with young POWs. German teenagers would practice English words, ask about America, share photographs of families they missed. The breaking of indoctrination. The medical care provided by American forces became the most effective denazification tool for captured teenage German soldiers. No amount of formal re-education could match the persuasive power of experiencing mercy from people they'd been taught were merciless, receiving care from enemies propaganda had depicted as monsters. The psychological impact operated at multiple levels. The immediate experience of medical treatment contradicted specific propaganda claims about American brutality. The sustained quality of care demonstrated systematic commitment to humanitarian values rather than individual aberrations. The professional competence of American medical personnel revealed organizational sophistication that contradicted Nazi claims about democratic decadence and chaos. 17-year-old Hermann Schultz, wounded during the Ruhr pocket fighting, described his transformation. I'd spent 3 years in Hitler Youth being taught that Americans were subhuman criminals who would torture and execute German prisoners. Within 48 hours of capture, American medics had saved my life. American nurses had provided care my own military hospitals couldn't match, and American soldiers had shared their food with me. Every single thing I'd been taught was revealed as lies. The medical care didn't just heal my wounds, it destroyed my faith in Nazi ideology. The denazification through medical care proved more effective than formal programs because it was experiential rather than educational. Teenage POWs didn't read about American values or hear lectures about democracy. They lived the evidence that Americans treated wounded enemies with dignity, that democratic societies could be simultaneously strong and compassionate, that military power didn't require cruelty. The medic's burden. For American combat medics treating teenage German POWs, the work carried psychological costs that exceeded the trauma of treating wounded American soldiers. They faced the moral complexity of having to save lives of young enemies they or their comrades had just wounded in combat, while struggling with anger at a regime that had sent children to die. The medics often experienced conflicting emotions simultaneously. Professional satisfaction at saving lives, rage at Nazi leaders who'd sacrificed children, grief for the teenage years these boys had lost to warfare, guilt about American actions that had wounded them, pride in demonstrating American values through medical care. Private First Class. Robert Henderson kept a diary documenting his experiences treating teenage German POWs near Magdeburg. Treated a 15-year-old kid today, shrapnel wounds to the chest and arm. He was terrified when I approached, kept trying to crawl away despite the wounds. When I finally got close enough to treat him, he was crying and begging in German. I think he was begging me to kill him quickly, rather than torture him. When he realized I was actually bandaging his wounds, he looked at me like I was performing a miracle. Saved his life. Don't know how I feel about that. He tried to kill Americans yesterday, but he's just a kid who never had a choice. This war is all wrong. The emotional burden was particularly heavy for medics who were also young. Men in their early 20s, treating boys only a few years younger. The small age gap made identification easier and more painful. These medics could imagine themselves in the teenage POWs' situations, could recognize how thin the line was between their own lives and the lives of enemies they were treating. Some medics coped by adopting paternal attitudes toward teenage POWs, treating them as surrogate sons or little brothers rather than enemies. Others maintained strict professional distance, focusing on medical tasks rather than emotional connections. Most struggled with finding balance between compassion that made the work meaningful and detachment that made it sustainable. The Geneva Convention in practice. American military medical doctrine made no distinctions based on age, nationality, or military status when treating wounded combatants. The Geneva Convention's provisions for medical neutrality were reinforced by training that emphasized treating all wounded as patients rather than enemies. Combat medics were explicitly instructed that their mission was saving lives regardless of the uniform those lives wore. But doctrine confronted complicated emotional reality when the wounded enemies were obviously children. American medics who'd treated wounded Wehrmacht veterans throughout the European campaign found themselves providing care to boys who looked young enough to be their sons or little brothers. The cognitive dissonance between enemy combatant and wounded child created moral and psychological challenges that medical training hadn't addressed. Corporal James Walsh, a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, described the emotional conflict in a letter to his wife. "We treat German wounded the same as our own. That's Geneva Convention and Army doctrine. But when the wounded German is 15 years old and crying for his mother while you're working on him, the professional distance becomes impossible. You can't see an enemy soldier. You just see a terrified kid who should be in school, not bleeding out in a foxhole." The medical treatment provided to teenage German POWs often exceeded minimum Geneva Convention requirements. Medics gave extra morphine to ease psychological trauma alongside physical pain. They spent additional time offering reassurance in broken German. They shared cigarettes and candy, provided comfort items from personal supplies, and generally treated young POWs with paternal care that went beyond clinical medical necessity. The lasting bonds. In many cases, the relationships formed between American medics and teenage German POWs during medical treatment created connections that lasted beyond the immediate crisis of battlefield medicine. Medics would check on young POWs during recovery, bring extra rations, help write letters to families, advocate for their transfer to better facilities. The bonds transcended the formal structure of captor and captive, medic and patient, victor and defeated. They became relationships between individuals who'd shared intense experiences, one who'd saved a life and one whose life had been saved. The shared experience created connections that couldn't be adequately captured by military categories or national identities. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano, a chief medic who'd treated dozens of teenage German POWs, maintained correspondence with several after the war ended. In a 1946 letter to his wife, he explained the connections. "These kids didn't choose the war or the ideology. They were victims as much as our own wounded soldiers were. When you save someone's life, you become responsible for that life in some way. I can't just walk away from the boys I patched up and pretend they don't matter. They matter because they're human beings who deserved better than what their government gave them." The post-war correspondence between American medics and former teenage POWs documented ongoing relationships that defied simple categories. The letters discussed recovery, rebuilding, hopes for the future. They expressed gratitude that transcended national boundaries and wartime enmities. They proved that mercy during war could create foundations for peace after war ended. The transformation through care. The systematic provision of medical care to teenage German POWs created transformation that operated at individual and collective levels. Individual teenagers discovered that enemies could be merciful. Collectively, a generation of young Germans experienced American values through direct action rather than propaganda. The transformation influenced post-war German attitudes toward America and democracy. Young men who'd experienced American medical care became advocates for Western alignment during Cold War political debates. They told families, friends, and eventually their own children about American medics who'd saved their lives when Nazi propaganda had promised only death. The medical care also influenced Americans' self-understanding of what their military service had meant. Medics who'd treated teenage German POWs found meaning in their service beyond military victory. They'd saved enemy lives when they could have let enemies die. They'd demonstrated that American values included mercy toward the defeated, especially toward young enemies who'd never chosen their allegiance. The closing memory. On March 7, 1995, 50 years after the Remagen Bridge crossing, 80-year-old Thomas Bennett attended an anniversary ceremony in Germany. A man approached him after the formal events, walking with a slight limp but otherwise healthy, prosperous-looking in a business suit. He studied Bennett's face carefully, then spoke in accented English. "Senator Bennett? You treated my leg wound on the day Americans took the bridge. I was 16 years old and expected to be executed. You saved my life and showed me that everything I'd been taught about Americans was propaganda." Bennett, memories flooding back across 5 decades, recognized something in the man's face, the echo of the terrified boy who'd thrown away his pistol and cried while Bennett wrapped his calf. "Klaus?" he asked tentatively. "Klaus Richter," the German confirmed. "I live in Bonn now. I'm a doctor, a surgeon. I chose medicine because of what you did that day. You showed me that healing is stronger than harming, that mercy matters even during war. I've spent my career trying to live up to the example you set when you treated an enemy child with the same care you'd give a friend." Bennett, typically reserved, found himself embracing the man who'd been a wounded boy. "I was just doing my job," he said quietly. "Geneva Convention said, 'Treat all wounded.' That's what I did." "No," Richter insisted. "The convention said the minimum you had to do. You did more. You gave comfort along with care. You treated me like I mattered, like my life had value even though I'd been your enemy hours earlier. That extra measure of humanity, that's what changed me. That's what I've tried to pass forward through my own medical career." The story of American medics treating teenage German POWs never became celebrated history. It was overshadowed by combat narratives, strategic decisions, and dramatic battlefield victories. Medical care for wounded enemies doesn't produce stirring imagery or clear heroes for popular consumption. But for the thousands of teenage German soldiers who survived wounds that would have killed them without American medical intervention, the medics who treated them represented the truest victory America achieved. Not the defeat of armies, but the demonstration that democratic values included mercy toward enemies, especially toward young enemies who'd been betrayed by their own leaders. The teenagers who expected execution and received medical care instead carried that experience throughout their lives. They became the generation that rebuilt Germany as a democracy, that aligned with the West during Cold War tensions, that taught their children American soldiers had been liberators rather than conquerors. And it began with medics who knelt beside wounded teenage enemies and provided care when they could have walked away, who wrapped bandages when they could have withheld treatment, who offered water and morphine and comfort to boys who'd tried to kill Americans hours earlier. They proved that mercy could survive even in total war's brutality, that professional medical ethics could transcend national hatreds, and that treating enemy children with humanity would create foundations for peace that military victory alone could never build. The bandages they wrapped on teenage German legs and arms became bridges across the deepest divide war could create. And those bridges proved stronger than any bomb or bullet in building the peaceful Europe that emerged from war's ruins.